in contrast to some places like the United States, where one response is, why the hell should we be listening to students on the streets? There's more of an attitude like, students are on the streets, maybe we should pay attention to what they're doing. Maybe we should join them there. I'm Jeffrey Wasserstrom. I'm author of Vigil, Hong Kong on the Brink, a very short account of events in Hong Kong up through 2019 protests. One of the things I thought about a lot writing this book was to what extent the 2019 protests were carrying forward previous traditions. Both previous traditions in Hong Kong, such as the 2003 protests against a new security law, the 2012 protests against a new national education law, and the 2014 umbrella movement, which I went over to witness part of and I found very inspiring. But I've also thought about what's new about these protests. So in many ways, they need to be seen as a continuation or a restarting of the umbrella movement, but one that was done by people who were determined to not make some of the same mistakes that were made then, and were bringing on board things that were going on in other parts of the world, things to learn from. One of the special things about Hong Kong is that it's both connected to China, so people were very aware of the history of student protests in China itself, including cities like Shanghai and Beijing, but they were also very globally minded people, so there was a lot of interest in things happening other places. During the umbrella movement, there was a lot of awareness of the sunflower movement that had taken place in Taiwan just a little bit before. There's also awareness of Occupy Wall Street. The movement had begun as Occupy Central with Love and Peace. And when the new protests began, there was awareness of a variety of things, including that the candlelight protests in South Korea had brought down a president. So the protesters were thinking, looking around the world, what could they borrow, thinking of their own traditions, both locally and over the border, but then also trying to avoid what were seen as some of the mistakes of umbrella. One of the mistakes was seen as there being too obvious leaders to identify, and the government could then remove them from the scene. So the movement from the beginning was quite leaderless, and that's been one of its strengths. It's also been one of the things that's made it hard for the movement to wind down or to figure out how to reach an endpoint. So one of the real differences is that leaderlessness. There are also just some brand new tactics that are being used. And one of the exciting things about the movement is win or fail, win or lose, whatever it's seen as that way, whether it achieves its goals in the end or even comes close to it, it's added things to the global repertoire of protest in a way that we just haven't seen happen before. Things like airport shutdowns, that's a new thing. The Lenin walls, the multiple Lenin walls. There was a Lenin wall during the umbrella movement, which was borrowed from something that had been set up in Prague in the early 1980s. And so it was adapted and made distinctively Hong Kong-like by using Post-it notes rather than paint to express opinions. But during this movement, there have been multiple ones. There have been walking Lenin walls, people who cover themselves with Post-it notes. There have been Lenin tunnels. And that, I think, is a great symbol to me of everything about the movement, that it's both connected with the past, drawing from international influences, and becoming something that's totally, uniquely, and inspiringly Hong Kong. So one of the key things about the protests of 2014 and 2019, and before that 2012, is that a lot of the protesters are very young. 2012, which was the one where Joshua Wong became a major figure for the first time, a local major figure, then he became an international one in 2014. He was in his mid-teens, so is Agnes Chow, who's been one of his comrades in arms throughout. And that's very young. I'm used to dealing with student movements tending to mean college students, tending to mean 20-somethings, or late teens, which the Tiananmen generation largely were. So this was even younger. In 2012, it was high school students. And in 2014, it was a mix of late teens and 20s. There were some very important protesters who were college students and involved with college unions then. And the movement in 2019 has been, again, some of the veterans of those movements, but also younger. There are 14-year-olds, there are 13-year-olds who are taking part in it. And so that's very interesting to me, and it's interesting both because it links up with Chinese traditions of protest, Hong Kong traditions of protest, this idea that educated youth as intellectuals of the future, have a duty to speak as the conscience of their community if there's something going seriously awry. Something that's maybe distinct to Hong Kong is this idea that different generations have specific roles to play. So a lot of the frontline protesters taking the most militant actions are quite young. But there have actually been protests by designated older groups, including gray hairs, which I can relate to in a certain way, being the age I am, who are saying, like, we want to turn out for a rally of people like us to show that we're in solidarity with the students, even if we're doing something different. One of the really most interesting moments of the whole 2019 movement to me was when there was a mothers' protest. A group of Hong Kong mothers held a rally. And the way they did it, the reason why they did it was because Carrie Lam, the chief executive of Hong Kong, had used familial imagery, maybe trying to play to some sort of Confucian idea that she's a mother and she sees herself as the mother of Hong Kong. And when her children are spoiled, she needs to discipline them. And she presented the protesters as falling to that category of spoiled children who need to be brought into line. And so a group of Hong Kong mothers held a rally to say, no, this is what real Hong Kong mothers do. They show that when their kids have a good point, they support them.